Conan, what is best in life?
To buy minis, have them built in front of you, and make excuses to not paint them.
That is good. That is good.
Oh, hello, Editing Juan here. I just realized my other self forgot to say something very important, so I have to fix it now, as usual. I just started offering one-on-one private online tutorings in my Patreon, so if you want to step up your painting game, check the link down below and join now. Back to the video. Hello fellow Herders of the Blue, and welcome to my channel, and also welcome to another episode of Heavy Contrast. Heavy Contrast is a series where I try to paint one miniature to the highest standard possible, using just contrast paints and highlights. And for this episode I'm very happy to announce that Games Workshop asked me to collaborate with them, making two painting tutorials, one for each of the new Warhammer Underworlds Gnarlwood box set warbands. For this second episode I'm painting Sarrakkar Blackwing from the Gnarlspirit Pack warband. In this video I'm going to explore different hues of leather, red and bone, as well as a tan skin tone. So, let's get cracking. As you can see, we're starting from a base coat of a Zenithal Prime using Sundry Dust all over and Wraith Bone just from above. And the first step will be to paint all of the skin, and for this I'm going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Gillivan Flesh and Gore-Grunta Fur because I want a tan look. This time I'm being quite careful applying it, not going over any other areas, because this is a Zenithal Prime and it would be quite hard to fix if I go over. A little bit is fine, but just don't want to make a mess. As you can see, I haven't glued his helmet on, and he's also not glued to the base, so I can remove it when I want to paint the inside of the legs and stuff like that. With the skin now base coated, and it's a really nice hue, I'm really happy with it, I'm going to base coat the Tawad, which is bright red, and for this I'm going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Lester's Red and Blood Angel's Red. As always, I'm using my Rosemary & Co. Series 33 size 3 brush for base coating, and it's usually also the brush I use for detail work as well. You can find a link to the brush in the description below or in the pinned comment of the video. Next I'm going to paint the cape, and for this I'm going to use a mix of 3 parts Lester's Red and 1 part Shai's Purple. This is going to give us a deeper, darker red look. Remember, the model is not glued to the base, so I will remove it and paint the inside bits as well. Now I'm going to paint all the fur using Basilicanum Grey. I will also paint with this the fur on the back. I will try to go section by section here because it's quite a large area, so I have the nicest, smoothest looking result possible. And I'm also going to apply this on his beard. And any of the leather you want to be black. A couple changes that I didn't mention just because I felt like doing them is I painted with Basilicanum Grey the beaks on the bird skulls and also all of the leather, not just the bits of leather that is going to be black. And now I'm going to paint the black details using Black Templar. Having the Basilicanum before makes the result way darker, which is what I want. And once this step is done, I think I'm going to glue him onto the base. Now going to paint all of the red leather details, and for this I'm going to use a mix of 1 part Lester's Red and 4 parts Gore-Grunta Fur. And now to paint all the bone details I'm going to use a mix of 4 parts Skeleton Horde, 1 part Wildwood and 1 part Medium. I don't want a very yellowy looking bone, that's why I'm adding the Wildwood. Now with the wood staff I'm going to use just pure Wildwood. There is only one detail left to paint, and that is the weapon handles and this inner trouser thing. And for this I'm going to use a mix of 1 part Basilicanum Grey, 1 part Skeleton Horde and 1 part Contrast Medium. Now I want to add a little bit more of color or interest to the top section of the hair, and for this I'm going to apply Black Templar on all the top section, about up to here. I'm going to clean the eye brush and I'm going to feather it out. I'm going to go section by section so I don't cause any mess. I'm also going to do the same on the beaks towards the bottom. I'm going to apply the Black Templar, clean the brush and feather it out. And because I'm not really happy how this looks, I'm just going to take Basilic Cannon Grey and cover it all the handles here. I think they should be darker. And here on the antlers, I'm going to take Gurkhan Fur and do the same. I'm going to apply it, clean my brush and feather it out. With all those contrast layers now applied, I think it's time to start highlighting, and I always like to start with the skin. The first highlight here will be Bestigor Flesh, which I'm going to thin down to a sort of heavy glaze consistency, and I am going to apply it over the top section of the skin. With that first highlight done, I'm going to move into Kislev Flesh for the second highlight. And again, thinning it down to the same heavy glaze consistency, I'm just going to start applying highlights towards the upper sections of each volume. I started with a yellowy skin tone for the base, but as I'm moving into the highlights, I move into a more pinkish hue, so it looks more natural. And now for the final highlight of the skin, I'm going to go yellow, and for this I'm just using Screaming Skull. Just going to apply this onto the absolute highest highlights. You have to be sparse with this, but using a yellowy paint to do the final highlights on the skin gives it a very natural look. As always, concentrated towards the top sections of each of the volumes. With the skin now highlighted, I'm going to add a bit of hues and tonal variation. For this I'm going with Silbuck Burgundy, which I'm thinning down to a very thin glaze using Lamian Medium. So I'm applying Sigval Burgundy in places where blood will flow more, nose, cheeks, knees, elbows, knuckles, those sort of places. And after all those glazes are done, I'm going back to Screaming Skull to re-establish the final highlight, which will be lost due to all that glazing. While I'm doing that highlight, I'm also going to use Screaming Skull to paint the teeth. With that done, it's now time to paint the eyes, and for this I'm just going to first paint them using Celestra Grey. You should never use pure white to paint the eyes themselves. It's way too bright and doesn't look natural. And now I'm going to take Black Templar and paint the iris. You have to be very careful here and just dot it in the middle of the eye. It might take a couple passes, but it will show nicely. And if you haven't noticed, I haven't changed my brush since the very beginning of the video. With the skin down, I'm going to highlight the hair and the fur, and for this I'm going to use Celestial Grey as my first highlight. Here where the beard meets the face, I'm going to simulate the hairs up to the face itself. I'm just going to paint them like it's growing a little bit higher than the hairline. While highlighting the fur here on the back, I'm just going to start with a thin edge highlight about here, and while the lower down I move, the thicker I make it, up to the very tips of the bottom hair, where I will be covering completely with this. I'm going to also use Celestial Grey on the weapon shafts here, just doing a thin edge highlight. I also did the same highlight on the beaks, and now for the next highlight and all the grey details I'm going to use Sulfuran Grey. So it will be just a very thin edge highlight. And now to finish off the light fur details, I'm going to use pure white and just do the smallest highlight. Just small dots at the very top here on the legs. Also catching the beard here. With all the light parts of the fur now done, I still have to paint the dark parts on the back and also all of the black details, and I'm going to paint them all in the same way, starting with a highlight of Stormvermin fur. I'm just going to do an edge highlight with this in all of the hairs. You will see here in the back where there is a point where the Stormvermin fur kind of mixes with the Celestial Grey that we used to highlight this, and it kind of blends together. That's when we're going to stop. I'm also going to do a thick edge highlight with this in all of the black details that are not fur. Remember, when you're doing thick edge highlights, the key is that you do an edge highlight that you know you can do a smaller one later on. For the next highlight on the black leather and on the black parts of the fur, I'm going to use a 1-to-1 mix of Stormvermin fur and Celestial Grey. And for the thin edge highlights, this is just trying to do the thinnest edge highlight you can. I know it's easy to say, but if you did your thick edge highlight well first, this shouldn't be too difficult. Just remember, it doesn't really matter how thin this is, as long as you have a line of the Stormvermin fur in between the base coat and this highlight. On the fur here, I'm going to basically highlight the peaks on the black bits here, so towards the extremes of the hair here, and maybe catch here where the fur makes like kind of a curve towards the sun. I'm going to pick this up with this color. And finally, for the black details, I'm going to use pure Celestial Grey as the final highlight. This will just be a dot highlight in the highest highlight. For example, here on the leg, I'm placing this dot right next to the highlight on the flesh, and I will do so with all of the other black details. So before we tackle the bone, I want to glue the helmet onto the head and just have everything glued together in one single piece. But before we do that, I have to finish base coating the horns. And for this, I'm going to start with the inner horns, onto which I will do a layer of skeleton horde over the Basilicanum grey that's present there. Once this dries, I will do a second layer. With the second application of skeleton horde now drying on the inner horns, I'm going to start painting the outside horns with a mix of 1 part skeleton horde and 1 part Gergrant fur. Now that I see it, while this is wet, I'm going to apply a little bit of skeleton horde here on the top to create a little bit of a lighter shade, because I think it needs a lighter shade on the top. This is all wet in wet blending, so I'm just taking skeleton horde and applying it at the top of the horns here to create like sort of a lighter hue. That first application of the Grunta and skeleton horde mix is now dry, and I'm going to apply a second layer, but concentrating it towards the tips and then feathering it out. With the second coat done, I'm now going to move into pure wildwood, and I will do the same, but just going lower and lower towards the front of the horns. I already did a layer here, and it's already dry, so I'm going to apply the second one. That is a big hat. And now we're going to move into the red I think I want to paint next. Just because I like painting red and I've been waiting for this since the very beginning. I'm going to start with the tabard, and the first highlight is going to be a thick edge highlight using Evilson Scarlet. This is a very simple highlight. It's going to be very faint, but we're basically just reinforcing what was there from the contrast layer. This is a tiny detail and we don't really want to make it too present on the mini. And for the next highlight, I'm going to use a 2-to-1 mix of Taulight Ochre and Evilson Scarlet. Instead of going the orange route, I chose to go with Taulight Ochre for my main highlights, and that is because I don't want a too bright of a red. Everything on this mini is quite muted, and I don't want to just paint a very stark looking red that is going to detract from the overall paint job. We're just going to do a very thin edge highlight with this. And for the final highlight on the red, I'm going to use pure Taulight Ochre. I'm going to do the same thin edge highlight, but just concentrating it towards the corners and peaks. Very small highlights here. We don't want to create distraction point on the mini, just to highlight the red in a very subtle way. Now for the darker red cape, I'm going to do a thick edge highlight using Wastaka Red. This is a very small detail and it's hidden behind the staff and stuff like that, so again we don't want to create too much attention here, but of course we have to highlight it, so I went for the pinkish red kind of route, which I think fits fantastically and is going to contrast very well with the more intense red of the tabard. With that first highlight done, I'm going to move into the second one. This will be a squeak orange. And with squeak orange, I'm just going to make the thinnest edge highlight possible. This is honestly quite similar to the mix of Taulight Ochre and Evilson Scarlet, so if you don't have a squeak orange and you just want to paint this the same way, that mix is going to be pretty much the same once everything is painted. But I have the color, so I'm going to use it. Here on the folds, with a thinner version, I'm just going to do some dots and some scratches to make this volumetric highlight very small. I don't want too much of a highlight here. The darker deposit of contrast at the bottom is doing all of the heavy lifting. I just want to emphasize this with a little bit of texture and a little bit of volume. And for the final highlight on the cloak, I'm going to use Cadian Fleshdown, and I'm going to do the same as with the Taulight Ochre in the tabard. I'm just going to do the same thin edge highlight, but concentrating it more towards the corners and edges and folds. With the red details done, I'm going to paint the reddish leather, and for this I'm just going to start directly with a thin edge highlight, in this case using Deathclaw Brown. I'm starting with a thin edge highlight because honestly it's just a tiny detail that really doesn't make any difference, and the quicker we get away with finishing this, the better. Now going to move into the next and probably final highlight for the leather. This will be Cadian flesh tone again. Again, this is a very tiny detail. You just want a little bit of highlighting so it doesn't feel flat. The same principle from the leather I'm going to apply into the wood shaft, just thin edge highlight with Baneblade Brown. Baneblade Brown is quite transparent, so if you thin it down just a little bit, you can create a very subtle edge highlight, even if it's quite brighter than the base coat. And by reinforcing those same lines again, you create another stage of highlight. And now for the final highlight on the wood, I'm just going to use Karak Stone. Karak Stone is the natural progression from Baneblade Brown. I'm just going to go with the natural route, creating a bit more highlights, re-emphasizing the previous edge highlights we did in the sharpest corners, and moving on to another detail. With the wood not finished, I'm going to concentrate on the lighter bone. And for the first highlight, I'm just going to use Karak Stone again. I'm just going to pick up the volumes that should be highlighted with Karak Stone. Karak Stone is super similar to the color that's already there, so I don't really need to do any blending. I'm just basically cleaning up the surfaces that are raised or facing towards the sun in this case. On the lower section of the bone here, I'm just going to do an edge highlight, which I will continue onto this part here on the top. The more I get into the brown section, the thinner the edge highlight is going to be. With that highlight done, I'm going to move into a 1-to-1 mix of Karak Stone and white. For the next highlight, please note that I also highlighted the inner horns with this, just doing some striations towards the front. I'm just going to take the same and just keep on doing this towards the tips here. And the rest of the bones, I'm just going to continue the volumetric highlights, especially in these very roundy bird skulls. These don't look good with very hard edge highlights. And now for the final highlight on the bone, I'm just going to use pure white. I'm just going to do a very small highlight of pure white on the top of the volumetric highlights and on the corners and places here like the very tips of the horns. I think it's time to finish all the bone with these darker ones, and for this I'm going to Baneblade Brown to make some edge highlights on the darkest bits of the bone, as we did with the wood, just very thin here. Emphasizing the striations, you will find that the Baneblade Brown disappears towards the top, and you don't really want to go too far down with this. Up until there, it's perfectly okay. With the back side of the bones finished, and that's all we're going to do there, I'm going to move on to the front, and here instead of picking up all the striations, I'm just going to simulate the light catching on the bone. I'm just going to go with Stonebem in Fur and do a very thin edge highlight just towards the top. Now I'm going to repeat the same but using Celestial Grey and concentrating it more towards its very tip. And finally I'm going to do the same but using Ulthuan Grey, and again I'm just going to concentrate this more towards the very tip, in this case right there. With everyone painted except for the metallic details, it's now time to base coat them, and since everything here is super warm I want to avoid any golds or coppers and stuff like that, and I'm going to paint them dark steel. And for the base coat I'm going to use Lead Belcher. And now I'm going to shade all the steel, or wrought iron because that's the look I'm going for, with a mix of 1 part Black Templar and 3 parts Contrast Medium. I'm going to go quite heavy on this. As I said, I want a dark iron look. With the shading now dry, I'm going to highlight it, and I'm going to start with Iron Hand Steel. You can mix Stonehold Silver with Lead Belcher if you want, that's also a valid option. I have all the colors, so why not use them? I'm basically just going to do an edge highlight with this. And for the final highlight on the steel, I'm going to use Stonehold Silver. And I'm just going to pick up corners and stuff like that. It's a very simple highlight, very minimal too. And with the base painted using my Crackle paint base in video, Sarrakkar is completely finished. I really enjoy painting the tan skin tone and the two-tone red clothes. I really hope you liked the video, and don't forget to catch the next one because I have something big prepared for that one. If you like my videos and like to help me make them, you can follow me on social media. You have the links to all my social media in the description below and in the pinned comment of this video. Share and like this video, but most importantly, there is Patreon and channel members. Patrons and members allow me to do all the cool videos that I want to make, and most importantly, they allow me to release them all for free here on YouTube. Perks include access to an amazing Discord community full of lovely people, early access to some of the videos, and now also private one-on-one online tutorings. At the time of the release of this video, there are still slots available for both tiers, 45 minutes and 3 hours a month. They are filling fast, so if you want to have a private tutoring with me, don't hesitate and join now. Help me and my family enjoy the list of the coolest persons in the planet, including Eudon, Giovanni Constanza, Jason, Martin Pasco, Alejandro Maldonado Fuentes, Elliot Sirach the Rhinosaur, Terry Denham, Howard Holdville, Robert Smith, Chris Gothenthal, Carlos Rivera, Thomas Usterkal, Javi Mota, Christoph Moret, Michael Boyer, Victor Domen, Nicholas Furnell, Christian Smith, Alfredo Phillips, Tino Uchida, Stephanie Aul, Nick DeMao, Faces and Bases, David Sutherland, Darkoath, Roger Nilsson, Tastet, Oscar Jonathan Torberg, Dan Mako, Cristalios, Jimmy Milligan, Kevin Mian, Darcy Farrar, Chris Fivey, Samuel, Natius Maximus, Arundel, Gabriel Smith, Joshua Bohannon, Mark Jarvis, Joe Simpson, Charles Armintas, GeForce, Dr. V, Lena Lindemann, Kieran Murthel, and Kevin Sullers. As for me, I will catch you in the next one. Bye!